is mainly focused on term 3 topics. Term 3 topics in preparation for the term 3 task and also for the term 3 end of term examination or test. Right. So since you understand, the focus areas might be different by provinces or by districts. If you happen to coincide that you have the same focus area of the topic that we're going to discuss here, that will be fortunate enough that you can benefit from this discussion. What we're going to do here is we are going to focus on a particular source-based question based on a specific topic and also discuss an essay question based also on another specific topic. Right. So if we check, we are going to look at segregation in South Africa in the 1920s and 1930s. That is our focus area. And for our source-based question, basically it's based on the impact of segregation and laws on the lives of Black South Africans. We understand the practice of segregation in the 1920s and 1930s in the Union of South Africa. It apparently disadvantaged the African communities and the African societies. There were several laws that were put in place which were to the benefit of the whites and to the disadvantage of the Black majority. Right, then our essay question, I also need to analyze your focus area. The essay focuses on African nationalism. I understand it might be different in another dimension that African nationalism can come as a source-based question in some other year or in some other point in time. But in this instance, we are focusing on African nationalism as an essay question. Right. So we want to go back to our source-based question, which is basically a question on segregation laws. Right. As usual, we'll be having our addendum where we will be checking our sources from. Right. So basically, this is our addendum and the addendum with the sources for the source-based question, question number 1. Right. Source 1A, we are going to the questions and try to figure out how we are going to use that source. Right. It is saying here, define the term Land Act of 1913 in your own words. We are supposed to. So the question is saying, define the term Land Act of 1913 in your own words. Right, let's get an idea or a clue of what the Land Act was. Right. The source highlights the effects of the 1913 Land Act. It says, the chief enemy of the South of the African people was and still is today the Land Act of 1913. It caused starvation because of breadwinner could not leave the country to provide for the big farmers of South Africa with cheap labor. Right. So it's giving us an idea of how the Native Land Act affected the people. But here our question, we want us to define the Native Land Act. We want to try to define in our own words the Native Land Act. Right. We understand that this is a legislation which was put in place in South Africa in 1913. What was its purpose? It was a segregation law. That is the first thing that you must note. The Native Land Act was a segregation law. Why are we saying it was segregation? Segregation, we understand it's forced separation. Forced separation, mainly on the idea of race. We force people to separate and not to associate and not to relate to each other in the same vicinity. So the Native Land Act, it was a segregation legislation. It was a segregation legislation. How did it work as a segregation legislation? It was a law which was forcing people to be split. It denied the rights for the natives. Natives are looking at the Africans to buy land from areas designated as white areas. Right, so we are saying here, there were areas that were designated as white areas, which implies that the natives or the African people had no right to try and buy land in those areas. The areas that were deemed white were supposed to only be having land owned by the whites and not by Africans. So for that matter, it was a legislation which was put in place to forcibly split people, to split the white people from the Africans. There was no instance that the white people would there was no reason that the Africans would interfere with the activities of the whites because their areas were separate. The black people were supposed to be staying in the homelands according to ethnicity, their ethnic groups, homelands of their ethnic groups. That was the designation, or that was the areas designated for the Africans, while the areas which were productive were meant to be occupied by the whites. So the Native Land Act was enacted in such a way that it was enforcing segregation by disallowing Africans to buy land from areas that were deemed to be white areas. It was either buying or renting land. It was disallowed for black people. That was the Native Land Act of 1913. Right. According to the source, what were the effects of Land Act? This is an extraction question. We just have to go to the source and figure out how it affected the people. Right. If we check the second statement, it says it caused starvation. This is an impact. There was starvation. And what are the impacts? Breadwinner would leave the country to provide the big farmers of South Africa with cheap labor. Right. You see, the context here of the breadwinner would leave the country. Which country was being left here? They were leaving the homelands. Remember, the homelands were regarded as independent and they were supposed to be self-governed. So it meant the breadwinners were forced to leave the homelands to provide the big farmers of South Africa with cheap labor. That was the other impact. So it forced Africans to leave their homes to work as cheap labor. We're providing cheap labor. And also it caused starvation. That was the impact according to the source. Right, moving on to the next question. Explain why the parents were not happy to work for the white farmer. Why were they not happy working for the white farmer? Right, let's try to check the context of the question. Right. My parents wanted to come here because it was safe for them to work on their own land rather than work for whites. They wanted to live peacefully and not under the permission of anybody. Right, so the question is saying, why were they not happy to work for the white farmer? Right, we are seeing here, they were happy during their old times when they were doing their own things. Now they're supposed to work for the white farmer. It says, my parents wanted to come here because it was safe. It was safe for them to work for themselves. So by working for the white farmer, it implies that it was no longer safe for them. So why were they not happy? Because initially it was when they were working at home was safe. and peaceful. Doing their own things. It was very safe when they were still working for themselves. And it was peaceful. Unlike working for the white farmer, it was not even safe. The working conditions were deplorable. They were not safe. And also, it was not peaceful. The white farmer was ultimately ill-treating the workers. It only wanted to benefit from the cheap labor of the Africans without taking care of their welfare. There was no peace. So, and also, working at home, they were not under permission of anybody. Nobody would ever tell them what to do. They were doing their own things under their own permission. So they were not under the permission of anybody, while they were still at home. And we can also argue that why were they not happy? They wanted their own freedom. They wanted their own freedom, their own liberty. They wanted to make their own decisions about their land. At home, they would decide whatever they wanted to grow on their land. But for the white man, you just be told how to work and what to produce on the farm, according to the decision of the white farmer. So because of those conditions, the parents were not happy. Their old way of life was disrupted by the Native Land Act, and apparently they were negatively impacted. They were not happy with that because they lost all those privileges. Right, moving on to the next question. The person is saying, comment on why the father says it was better to buy their own land. It was better to buy their own land. The father is commenting that here in this situation, it is better that they buy their own land instead of them having to work for the white farmer. Right, why they were advocating for buying their own land? One, because they could feed their own family. They could feed their own family. Having your own land, producing your own products, it implied that they would be able to be in a position of feeding their own family. We are told that there was starvation here, which was brought by the movement of breadwinners from the country into white farmer areas to work for the white farmer under exploitative conditions and to provide forced labor there. So it was ultimately a negative implication on the provision of the provision of food to the family. The families were starving. So if they would have their own land, it implied that they would be able to produce enough food and feed their own family. And also, if we check in the source, um, they wanted to grow maize and beans. It's another reason. They also wanted to grow maize and beans for their own, be able to feed their family, like what we've been talking about. And also, it talks about it was much better than working in Johannesburg because that is no place for his children to live a proper life here. It implied that the place was not safe for the bringing up of the children. If they would have their own land, it meant that the children would grow up under proper supervision and under proper conditions in safe places. But having to grow in Johannesburg, it was regarded as a place which is not safe for the upbringing of the children. So that was the other reason. It was not safe or a proper place for the upbringing of the children and family. Right. So by having on land, it meant that they were going to overcome the problem of the limited safety, which is associated with having to stay in Joburg, as indicated in the source. Right. We move on to the next source. That is source 1B. Source 1B, the following source explains the separate residential areas pre-apartheid era. It's talking about the separate residential areas. Right. We are looking at here segregation in urban areas whereby Black people were supposed to occupy given areas that were designated to them. And also whites had got areas that were also meant for them. And as a result of segregation, they would not infuse into each other, meaning to say Black people would not go to white areas and try to stay there, whilst the whites were enforcing segregation for their own benefit, and it also implied that white areas were the best areas in urban areas, whilst the Black areas were very poor areas in terms of the nature of the buildings, the nature of infrastructure, living conditions. Right. So that is basically the Black Urban Areas Act of 1923. Right. We go to our questions. Question number 1.21. How, according to the source, did Urban Areas Act regulate housing spaces where Black inhabitants could legally settle? Right, this is an extraction question. We just go to the source. Urban Areas Act regulate housing spaces where Black inhabitants could legally settle. Right. The Black Urban Areas Act 21 of 1923 enabled the development of separate residential areas for Black residents in the vicinity of urban centers. In particular, the Act regulated housing spaces where Black inhabitants could legally settle by, that is where we get our answer, authorizing local authorities to demarcate, to plan, and develop separate locations. So we are seeing in this instance that as a way of practicing segregation in urban areas, they offered some areas in the vicinity of the urban centers for Blacks. And they were supposed to regulate housing spaces where Blacks could settle legally. So they authorized local authorities. Local authorities are looking at municipalities to demarcate, like to mark the boundaries of those areas which were meant for the Blacks, and to plan, come out with a plan for the housing units meant for the Africans, and also develop separate locations. That was the plan. Right, we'll move on to the next question, number 1.2.2. Explain the usefulness of the source to a historian studying the Black Urban Areas Act of 21, Act 21 of 1923 in separate residential, in separation residential areas. Right. If we check on usefulness, we want to try to find information in the source. We are analyzing the information in the source to find out information which is of substance, information which is tangible, which helps someone understand how it happened and how the things unfolded. Right. So if we go through our sources, you tend to find that there's information that you can attribute to a very useful information for the understanding of that particular historical event. Right. Like, for example, it talks about local authorities. This was urban residential segregation, thus enabled local authorities to implement influx control measures and administer stricter pass laws. It's a useful information. Why? We are saying here, why were they practicing all such segregation, and why were they controlling those areas? It ultimately enabled, the source tells us that it enabled local authorities to implement influx control measures. What we call influx control measures, we are looking at the coming of Africans into cities and towns. By demarcating their areas and also planning for their residential areas, it was easy for the municipalities, the police, to monitor the movement of people into the cities and towns. So it's useful information that we get there. And also it talks about the establishment of the hostels, empowered to demarcate planned spaces. These areas included locations, vacant municipal land or buildings and hostels. Right. If we check, it talks us about the other useful information. If you check in the source, it also talks about the establishment of hostel accommodation. Right. It's also another useful information. We get to understand that there was the establishment of hostel accommodation for single black men. Single black men who were supposed to be working in the cities and towns. They had a special kind of arrangement of accommodation, which was called the hostels, which was only meant for the single men. Remember, families were supposed to remain in the homelands. Only physically able-bodied men were the ones who wanted in the cities and towns to work for the white-owned industries. So there were hostels which were established. It's also useful information. It talks about the establishment of hostels for accommodation for single black men. And also, if you check closely, the source also talks about leasing of municipal plots to black tenants. It's also useful information that we get to know that there was a provision for the leasing of municipal plots to some black tenants who could afford to get those leased properties. Right. So basically, that is useful information that we get from the source. Right. Moving on with the questions. Why do you think there was increased levels of urbanization in the 1940s? Why do you think there was increased urbanization? The numbers of people in cities and towns were increasing in the 1940s. They were increased levels. Why did it get to increase in the 1940s? Right. The reason there is clear, is that most people from rural areas came to urban areas to look for employment opportunities. Right. During that time of the 1940s, there was increased movement of people from rural areas going to cities and towns to try to look for opportunities of getting employed. The conditions in the rural areas, in the homelands, they were very hard for an average African person. The land was not very productive, and also the land was eroded. There was limited farming space. So the only way to find a better survival means was to go to the cities and towns and try to find employment. So that is why we have increased urbanization in the 1940s. People were coming from rural areas into cities to try and find employment opportunities. Right, we move on to the next question. What message is conveyed in this source regarding segregation in urban areas? Right. That is a visual source. Let's try to analyze our visual source and see the message. Right. When a question is saying what message, you must use visual clues. Use what you see to derive a deeper meaning of what it means. So we are looking at this. It's new locations such as Mansfield, which were established to the southwest of Joburg, beyond the municipal boundaries. So we are seeing those, that is the typical condition of an area for the Africans in the cities. Those areas that were designed to accommodate the Africans. According to the planning of the local authorities, the municipalities were given the mandate to demarcate and plan for such accommodations for the African people. So that is the visual. The question is saying, what message is conveyed in this source regarding segregation in urban areas? Right. The message that we can derive here, according to what we see. What we see here, it gives us an impression that segregation it meant that blacks stayed in old and dilapidated. It's clear if we check this, this looks like to be a very old building and unmaintained and is dilapidated, is almost crumbling. So, according to segregation, it implies that the blacks were supposed to stay in these areas, while the whites were staying in the best areas and well-maintained areas. And also, if we try to check there, these hostels are clustered together. If you see this block, this is a block with different uh, hostels, and they are clustered together. Like that is just one block which is demarcated and will be having separate doors for separate individuals in a cluster like that, which was not typical of the white areas. And also, if we check, we also have evidence of poverty. Segregation implied that black areas were poor areas. If you check these children, the way they are appearing like they are not well furnished, they are not well nourished. They look like they are malnourished and they look like things are not going well. So there's evidence of poverty in the black segregated areas. So anything that you can visualize and derive a deeper meaning from what you are seeing there qualifies to be a correct response to the question. Right, we move on to the next question. Right, our next question is question number 1.3.2, 1.2.2 rather. Right, 1.3.2, it says, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the government decided to set up new locations for black people. Why did they decide to set up a location on for black people? Right. One of the major reasons why the government decided to set up new locations for black people was for influx control. So I will write the responses here. Right, one of the major reasons That's 1.3.2. Right. One of the reasons was to implement influx control measures. The government wanted to implement influx control measures to control the movement of Africans into cities and towns. So by setting aside new townships for Africans, it was possible that the government would be able to implement measures to control the movement of people into cities and into towns. And also, for ease access to labor supply. They also did that to ensure that they have ease access to labor supply. So by setting areas for Black people, they were guaranteed that the Black people will be able to find a space for them to stay while they were providing labor in the white-owned industries. And also, we can argue that the other reason was that to administer stricter pass laws. It was also possible for them to administer strict pass laws by demarcating the white areas from the black areas. They will be able to monitor whoever was staying in the black areas in cities and try to figure out who has got the right documentation and who doesn't have the right documentation. It was possible now for them to implement strict pass laws to control the movement of people from cities and from rural areas into cities and towns. And also, lastly, we can say to ensure that the Urban Areas Act as part of the legislation that was put in place, the Urban Areas Act 21 of 1923, they also wanted to ensure that it was also strictly adhered to by limiting those areas. It was part of the prescriptions of the law that the areas were supposed to be separate. And that is why they had to develop new areas for the African community. That was number 1.3.2. We move on to the next question, which is question number 1.4, which is based on source 1D. Right. Comment on why, according to the source, was it important for Jan Smuts to strongly support the idea of residential segregation. Jan Smuts was supporting the idea of separate residential areas. Why? Right, we go to our source. It's an extraction question. We just want to figure out our responses from the source. Right, by about 1923, about 126,000 Africans were living on the rand, including 13,000 rather, women, and 25,000 children. So that is where we extract our reason there. Why Jan Smuts was interested in separate development, which continues like the municipal authorities were worried about the number of Africans, particularly women who were moving into towns. And also it says some white people feared that they might be swarmed by many Africans moving into towns. Right. So because of those reasons, they qualify the worry for Jan Smuts and his need to implement segregatory residential areas. Right, so we are seeing the first reason is about the number of people who are living on the rand. 126,000 people, Africans, were living on the rand, which meant that there was now infusion of the white community with the black community. There was need to establish a strictly segregated area for black people to stay on their own and not interfere with the whites. And also, we are told of the number of women and children. The coming of women into cities was a worrisome thing. Those women were going to further produce children in the towns and keep on increasing the population size of Africans in the towns. And also, the municipalities were worried about the number of Africans. It's another reason. They worried about the number of Africans who were moving into cities and towns. If this trend continues, then what is going to happen later on? The white people feared would be swamped. So these are your responses. Remember, it's a 4x1. This is one response. This is another response, another response, another response to qualify for marks. Right. We move on to the next question. What is implied by the statement swarmed by so many Africans moving to the towns? Being swarmed by so many Africans. That was the fear of the whites, that we are going to be swarmed by Africans. Right. If something is being swarmed, we're looking at a swarm of bees. It means the whites felt that Africans would crowd them. In what was meant to be their neighborhood. Right. So the whites, they were feeling like these Africans will crowd them in what was meant to be their neighborhood. Because of the increasing numbers, they were now overwhelming the areas that were meant to be white area neighborhoods. So they were feeling threatened by the effect of so many Africans moving into cities and towns. They were feeling like they are being overcrowded. They would crowd them in their own areas. Or we can say also they were fearing the economic and political challenges that Africans would pose on them because of the large numbers of people who were getting into cities and towns. They were fearing that at some point in time, we might lose our economic and political advantage because of these people. For example, using trade unionism. If there are many in the cities and towns and they get to engage in a violent strike, for example, they were going to overpower and gain momentum over the whites because the whites were a minority group. Or we can also argue that they were no longer receiving the privileges from the government. The whites, they were saying we were being swamped because they were no longer receiving from the government. Because the government was overwhelmed, it had to cater. The municipalities had to cater for a large number of people because of increasing numbers of people moving into cities and towns, which meant that the privileges that the whites were enjoying, the funding was no longer enough to keep sustaining such privileges. That is why they were feeling that we were being swarmed by these guys, by the Africans. Right. We got number 143. Explain why Jan Smuts strongly supported the ideas of residential segregation. Why Jan Smuts supported the idea of separate areas of residence between the whites and the blacks. Right, if we check here, we can argue, that's number 143. I will just write it here. Why he wanted to protect and secure he ultimately wanted to protect and secure the whites with their privileges. By separating them from blacks, it meant that it was able now for the government was able now to apply a policy of separate development. They would develop areas which are deemed to be white areas while it's neglecting areas for the blacks, such that the whites would still continue enjoying the privileges from the government. So by separating people, it was now easy to apply a policy of a separate development. For example, infrastructure, they would develop the best infrastructure in the areas of the whites, like roads, while it's neglecting areas for the blacks. And also we can argue in the sense that if Africans moved into cities in that instance, the government would spend more money since the resources and opportunities in the areas were severely limited. So they wanted also, because remember, it was also partly a way of implementing stricter pass laws. So they wanted to regulate also the number of people so that the government won't be overwhelmed in terms of its expenditure. If they would limit the number of people in the urban areas, it will also imply that the government would be able to provide according to its planned budgets. But if they were continuously coming into cities and towns, the Africans, they were going to ultimately give a strain on the budget. So it's another way of protecting the government resources and reserving the resources such that the government won't be overwhelmed by supporting a large number of people in cities and towns. Right, we'll move on to number 1.4.4. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why the Native Urban Areas Act was passed by Jan Smuts' government. Why was it passed? Right. The first and obvious reason was to reduce access. 144. It was a law which was meant to limit the access to towns by the Africans, the blacks. And also, we can say it was also implemented to clear slums and give municipal authorities power, control, and create separate locations for Africans. By the edges of the towns. Right. So the other aim was to clear slums. There were slums developing, what we call the slums. You're looking at the shanty towns, the informal settlements. So they were supposed to clear them. By designating a specific area for settlement of the Africans, it meant that no any other area would be occupied if it's not designated for that purpose. So it was a way of clearing slums and also giving municipal authorities power to control and create separate locations. It is through that legislation that the municipalities were given power to demarcate areas and to create locations for the Africans on the edges of the towns. Then lastly, it's a paragraph question. Now, sort number 1.5 is consult source 1C and 1D. How does the information in source 1C support the evidence in source 1D? Right, when you're answering this question, remember to follow the standard prescribed way of answering the question. When you're comparing sources, you use the prescribed format. You don't compare sources using any other format, which is not the right format of comparison of sources. Right, I'll indicate what I'm saying here by prescribed format of comparison or contrast of sources. Right, we want to analyze the two sources and find similarities between them. That is comparison of sources. So we are doing a comparison of source 1C and 1D. So you say in your answer, source, this is number 1.5, 1C says whatever. Let's see source 1C, is it a visual or is a written? Right, if we check source 1C, it's a visual, and source 1D is written. All right, so this one here, since it's a visual, we cannot say it says because it's not written, it's a visual. It shows. Source 1C shows whatever, and this is supported by source 1D, which says. Right, this is how you compare your sources. Source 1C shows it's a visual source, what is shown there, and how is it similar to what is said in source 1D. And this is supported by source 1D, which says an idea, which is the same. So you must find something here in the first source, on the visual source, and see how that idea is portrayed or is presented or is given in source 1D as a written source. And this will going to give you 2 marks. Remember, this is a 2 by 2 4-mark question. You're not supposed to give one response. Most of the learners, they miss marks by not giving sufficient responses. If you give this, don't think there's 2 marks here and there's 2 marks here. It's only 2 marks for the full response with a comparison of an idea in source 1C and an idea in source 1D. Then you give another bullet. Source, the same format. 1C shows whatever, and this is supported by, so that you get the other 2 marks to make it 4. So what I encourage you here is just find a simple idea which is portrayed in the source and see if that very same idea is also shown in the other source. Do not bunch your ideas like you present 2, 3 ideas in the same presentation. Just pick a specific idea and see how it is portrayed in the other source. So that is basically how you tend to answer that particular question. So, like for example, you want to present an idea. Source 1C, it shows a new location, Mansfield, which was established for Africans. It's an idea again. We are seeing that this is a new location according to the writing, the caption on the caption on below the illustration here below the photo. It says new locations such as Mansfield were established. Right. And how is that supported? You check how this source is talking about the development of new towns, of new locations for Africans. It's one idea. Then you go and find again. It talks about so many Africans moving, living on the rand, as an example. It's supported here. We are seeing so many children It shows that there were so many people who were moving into cities and towns. These children probably have got parents. And it implies that the numbers of people were so many. So source 1C shows a number of children in an African township. And this is supported by source 1D, which says there were so many Africans, including children, who were getting into cities and towns. That way, that is how you compare your sources. And you must give independent ideas. If you present one idea in the first answer for 2 marks, find another different idea to present in the other response, which is different from the first one. Right, that is how you answer that question. Then the paragraph question is the last question. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining the impact of segregation laws on the lives of Black South Africans. So you are explaining the impact here. When you're answering your paragraph question, remember your paragraph must be in the PIL format. You must always answer your paragraph in PIL format. The very same way you write your paragraphs in the essay is the same way you must write your paragraph when you're answering a paragraph 8-mark question. So in this matter, when you are following your format of the paragraphs, we understand that a paragraph which is in history is supposed to be written in the PIL format. That is how you must answer your paragraph. Meaning to say for the P, we want a point or we want an answer. Then we want explanation. And we want evidence. And then we want a linking statement. So you must have an answer to the question. The question is saying, explaining the impact of segregation. You must come out with your independent answer. According to your understanding, what was the impact? In terms of impact, you can say it was negative or it was positive. But if you check according to your understanding of the impacts of the segregatory laws, they brought negative impacts. So you can start your paragraph by indicating the nature of the impact here. Like segregation laws brought significantly negative impacts on the lives of Black South Africans. It's an impact. You're addressing the question. We want to see an answer. We must explain on the impacts. Give us an idea or independent idea of how you are going to attack the question. So you are like, according to how I feel it brought misery and suffering to the lives of Black South Africans. That is my opinion. That is my independent response, which I must support now. Then after I've answered the question, then why am I saying it brought significantly negative impacts and it brought misery to the lives of Africans? I'm now explaining the segregatory laws. If you don't have an idea, use the ideas in the source to explain, but you explain in your own words. You can check some ideas how blacks were affected and you convert them into your own words. You talk about the Native Land Act, for example. It denied Africans the right to buy land in some areas because those areas were deemed to be white areas. It's a negative implication. It led to extreme starvation for the African communities, and it forced the African communities to become forced laborers for the whites. You are explaining in your own words why you are saying it brought negative implications on the lives of Africans. You figure out on the side of the Urban Areas Act, how did it impact on it limited Black people's access to cities and towns, which is a negative impact. So you are explaining. Then you now go to find evidence. That is where you now quote your sources. You find an idea in the source which is supporting what you explained, and you put the source at the end in brackets. That is how you give your evidence. So you put your answer, you explain your answer independently in your own words. Then here you quote sources. And when you are quoting sources, we are not saying you are supposed to copy. You take the idea and you rephrase it to your own words. What is required there is the idea, you rephrase it. Then after that, you link a linking statement. We are saying, how is what you presented? Answering the question. Whatever you were saying here, how is it answering the question? Because your answer to the question is saying the segregatory laws, they brought misery to the African lives. It posed a negative impact on the lives of Africans. How is that negative, what you were explaining? To what extent is that negative? You give a supporting statement at the end to show that this brought significantly negative implications, or it brought suffering to the lives of the Africans. That is your linking statement, which comes at the end of your presentation. Yes, the last statement of your paragraph. Then, if your paragraph comprises of those elements, then it qualifies to become a level 3 paragraph, which can give you from 6 to 8 marks. Right, that is the end of our paragraph, our essay, our source-based question. Right, for the essay question, I'll just give you insights of how you can answer that particular question. Right, it's on African nationalism. It says Black South Africans were deprived of their political. They were deprived of their political, economic, and social rights. That is what the statement is saying. That blacks were deprived of their political, economic, and social rights in the early 1900s. And what did that do to the Africans? It paved way for the rise of African nationalisms. Right, so we are seeing that's the idea, that's the picture of the question. We want to look at how the blacks were deprived of their rights, and their rights in the dimension of political rights, of economic rights, and also in the dimension of the social rights. So for that reason, it led to the coming together of Africans and their willingness to adopt an idea of African nationalism to regain their lost privileges and their lost rights because of the deprivation of their rights, which were lost through unfair practices like segregation. So the question goes on to say, do you agree with the statement? That is where the question is. Do you agree with the statement? And motivate your answer with relevant historical evidence. Right, so that is basically your question that you need to address. And we need to answer our question according to our precept of answering the questions of history essays. Right, we understand when you're answering the question, we must start with an introduction. That is the first part of your answer. Your essay must start with an introduction. And the introduction in that matter must be a contextualized introduction. An introduction which is contextualized, we are looking at an introduction which is addressing the basic requirements of a history presentation of an essay. It must have the 3 steps that we have in the introduction of an essay. Right, so I'll just highlight here how you are supposed to check on that and how you are supposed to attempt that particular essay question. Right, we are talking about an introduction which is contextualized. Let me start by indicating how you can contextualize your introduction. Right, we come here Let me just use this space here to do the presentation. You must start with a contextualized introduction. And your contextualized introduction must have the 3 steps that you must always encompass when you're presenting your introduction. Right. Remember also when you're writing your essays, you do not need to put subheadings, you don't need to underline, you don't need to highlight, no bullets. You just write your paragraphs in the continuous format. Right. So I will indicate that in your introduction here, what are you supposed to do? When you are writing your introduction, you must have 3 steps. Step number 1, it must have an answer. We cannot start an essay without answering the question. We need to answer the question first. And the answer is a direct response to the question. Don't start by explaining anything. Give a direct response to the question. Respond to the question which has been posed. Or adopt what we call a line of argument. This is one and the same thing. That's the first step in your introduction. Then step number 2, you are supposed to give reasons. Why are you answering the question that way? What reasons are you having which made you believe what you have believed in the answer? And you are giving general reasons. You're not explaining here in detail. You are giving just a rough idea of why you adopted that line of argument. Because, like, for example, if a person is saying, do you agree? You can choose to agree or you can disagree with the statement. Then why are you agreeing? We want general reasons. And why are you disagreeing if you chose to disagree in your line of argument? We need substance. We need to check on the reasons why you chose to agree to the statement or why you chose not to agree with the statement. Right. Then we move on to the reasons. You give the reasons. Then after the reasons, you are supposed to give an elaboration or what you call orientation. Here we are saying, give the direction of the essay. What historical evidence are you going to present in the in your presentation, in your essay? What are you going to be discussing about? That is the orientation part of the presentation. Right. So in your answer, we are saying, the question is saying, do you agree with the statement? So we want to see whether you are in agreement or you are in disagreement. That is your answer to the question, because that is where the question is. Are you agreeing or you are disagreeing? That is what you want to see. Why are you agreeing? You give general reasons. For example, blacks were denied access to urban areas through Urban Areas Act. It's a deprivation of a social right. You're supposed to associate with whoever you want. If you want to go and stay with people in town, you must be allowed to go there. It's your social right. But if there is a regulation which is disallowing someone to go and socialize with people of their choice or going to stay in areas of their interest, then that is social right deprivation. Or you can talk of economic deprivation through the Native Land Act. The Native Land Act denied African people to buy land or rent land in some areas that were designated for the whites. It's a deprivation of economic right. We know well that land is an important resource towards economic sustenance. But if you are denied access, you are giving reasons there. Then you come to elaboration. What is the essay going to prove? This essay is going to further elaborate on what? What are you going to talk about in the essay? The deprivation of rights of Africans, and apparently how the Africans got to adopt the idea of African nationalism. That is basically your introduction. Then you go to your paragraphs. As you write your paragraphs, remember, your paragraphs must always be in the peel format, and you must present your ideas according to the peel way of presentation of your paragraphs. And remember, you must accommodate the ideas of political deprivation. You indicate how political deprivation happened. Like, for example, you talk of the vote. Africans were denied their right to participate in the politics of the country. They were disallowed to vote. Then, economic rights. You can talk of things like Land to Land Act, how it deprived the blacks access to land. You talk of social rights, how they were denied access to social privileges. Then you need to go on and link that those deprivations to the rise of African nationalisms. When you're talking of the rise of African nationalisms here, I understand you have to relate to the coming together of Africans to fight for a common cause, to fight against such deprivation. Like that is where you go to talk about the formation of the South African Native National Congress, which was later on renamed the ANC. Then you also talk about the South African, you also talk about the ideas of the Native National Congress, how they were trying to negotiate with the white government for the realization of the political and economic and social rights that they were deprived of. But however, their ways of negotiation, remember, they were adopting a moderate approach, which did not ultimately give them the intended result. Then you talk about all those things, and in your presentation also, remember, that is where you can also talk of the formation of the renaming of the SANNC to ANC. Yes. And the involvement of the youth, the formation of the Youth League is a very important thing because it changed the political perspective of African nationalists. The nationalists who were there in the old ANC, which was the SANNC by then, they were adopting a moderate approach of negotiation of petitions against deprivation of political rights. But however, it did not work. So the coming in of the youth is a significant impact on the rise of African nationalisms. You also talk of the ideas that were brought in by the Youth League and how they changed the political terrain. You will be addressing now the part of rise of African nationalism. So your paragraphs must address the deprivation and also must address the rise of African nationalisms. How then Black people got to unite and start to fight for a common cause since they were subjected to the same deprivations. Then you do your presentation, and lastly, you need to come to a conclusion of your presentation, right? When you are concluding your presentation, remember, you need to conclude your essay correctly. When you get to the conclusion, we are saying you are tying up your argument. When you're tying up your argument, you are saying you are coming to the end of your discussion. You are wrapping up your discussion. You cannot introduce no new ideas. You don't have new ideas here. You never talked about something else. Then you put it in the conclusion. You cannot conclude by introducing something new. And lastly, you can reaffirm. Reaffirming a key point or key aspects of your discussion. but not repeating how you presented the idea in the discussion. You are just reaffirming what you think maybe is of core substance in your whole presentation. You are reaffirming key aspects. That is how you come out with your conclusion. And apparently that gives you a better mark for your essay. If you have got your number of points which you have presented, and also if you have presented them in the right way, then your essay qualifies a higher level for presentation and also a higher level for content that is going to give you better marks in the end of your presentation. Right. With this being said and done, I think we have come to the end of our discussion. And I hope this discussion is going to assist you in your preparation for term 3 tasks or tests, and also for your final examination. Some of these topics, if you are doing those topics, they will be there again in the final paper. So you need to be well equipped with both the content and also the skills that are required in answering the questions. And also remember, when you're answering questions, do not apply what you apply in other subjects. It might be very relevant that in other subjects you write essays by putting subheadings and bullets are allowed, and also maybe if highlighting is allowed and underlining. That is specifically for those subjects. In history, you don't do that when you're writing your essays. You don't put any heading, no subheading, no bullets, no underlining, no highlighting until you get to the end of your presentation. Thank you for watching your host. We'll meet in other programs.